Hi, good evening, everybody. This is Steve with Real Progressives. And, I found today I woke up very early and I realized, as much as we talk about modern monetary theory, we need to focus sometimes just on the basics around here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start the show off with Stephanie Kelton's, 10 things. Hopefully this is something that you guys can really, really get your head wrapped around as we go into this. I think it's a good way of setting the stage. It's kind of like if I play that video, why am I even going to speak? But it's Stephanie Kelton, and there's 10 things that she wants you to know about the economy. And it's from her presidential lecture series at Stony Brook. And I found it to be probably the best of all the different videos. And I've watched all of them, or I've watched a lot of them. So here we go with this. I'm going to go ahead and get this thing started.
The sky is always falling. So what I would like this afternoon to be is essentially a form of group therapy, because we need it, okay? Because they're scaring us with these stories about how it's unpatriotic, how it's burdening the next generation, how it's dooming us to a future of higher taxes, catastrophe for the nation, right? And I want to try to lower the temperature, get us to the point where we can, at whatever age it's legal to do so, open a nice bottle of red wine, read the newspaper, see the headline, national debt is at an all-time high, and have that nice glow about us and feel at peace with the world, right? There's no reason to panic. The government's budget is nothing like a household budget. This is the problem. They're not like us. Their budget doesn't work the way our budgets work. Deficit spending by the federal government isn't the same as you and I spending more than we make year after year. Borrowing by the federal government isn't the same as you and I going out and putting money on a credit card. One of us issues the currency. They do. The other one of us, you and I, are merely using the US dollar. So we have a distinction to make between currency issuers and currency users. The issuer of the currency, the federal government in this case, can never run out of it, can never go broke, can never have bills coming due that it can't afford to pay, can't become insolvent, can't end up like people you may know, right, who took on too much debt and got into trouble and were forced into bankruptcy. My deficit, my red ink, is your black ink. Okay, here it is with actual historical data for the US going back to 1960. The red line is my account balance. Okay, the red line is my financial balance. The black line is the private sector in the US. It's all the households, it's all the businesses in the US combined. And what do you notice? I'm almost always in the red, my budget is almost always in deficit, and yours is almost always in surplus. And not only that, they tend to move opposite one another, meaning when I run bigger deficits, you all end up with bigger surpluses, okay? So my red ink is your black ink. So when you see a headline like this one, right, from the Wall Street Journal just a few days ago, trillion-dollar deficits could be the new normal. This is meant to shock and frighten. Trillion-dollar deficits could be the new normal, but take a breath and read it this way. Watch the word deficit. Don't you feel better? Don't you feel better? The national debt is all of the outstanding treasury bonds that the government spent the money into the economy, didn't tax it back, and then traded the cash for a different financial instrument called a security, a government bond, okay? So the entire national debt is nothing more than a record, a historical record of all of the dollars that were spent into the economy, not taxed back, and are currently being held in the form of US treasuries. That's all the national debt is. What do we really owe China? So I have a friend who's a bond trader. He's a fixed income guy, trades government bonds, and his name is Warren Mosler. And Warren will often say, the only thing we owe China is a bank statement. Okay, he's being a little bit funny, but essentially at the end of the day, that's about it. Okay, what do we owe China? A bank statement. Okay, we already got the stuff. We traded it for a treasury, and at the end of the day, as long as China wants to orient its economy around exporting in order to grow, in order to create jobs, then we're the beneficiary in this bargain. Eliminating the national debt means eliminating all of those safe securities called US Treasuries that people like to hold in their portfolios, because that's what the national debt is. You pay off the debt, you eliminate the debt, there are no more Treasury securities anywhere. They're done. So why does that happen? Why does something that sounds so good and fiscally responsible, running budget surpluses and paying down debt, why does it tend to coincide with bad economic consequences? Why do we end up with depressions and the Great Recession? And very quickly, because we could talk for an hour about this picture, but I want to just show you, this is where we were with Bill Clinton. That is the government's budget moving into surplus. You can see the red. That's the government's deficit. Government's almost always in deficit. But there were those 4 years right there under Bill Clinton when the government's budget moved into surplus. And there was great celebration, right? This is the first time in generations that the budget has been in surplus. This is the fiscally responsible thing to do. You know, Democrats delivered this. Well, yeah, but guess what? Look what happened to the private sector's financial position. Right? It was built on the backs of the private sector. The private sector's financial balance went deeply in the red, and that's what allowed the public sector's balance to move temporarily into the black. But it didn't last, and it can't last. Why? Because it was driven by primarily households spending more than their income, borrowing on the back of a dot-com bubble and then a housing bubble, and eventually the whole thing unravels. Too much debt, mostly for households. Inflation is every central banker's public enemy number one. That's what he's worried about. Okay, so can you imagine if instead of saying Social Security is going broke, we have to cut benefits, the system is unsustainable, forget all of that. If instead of that, we were saying, what are the things that we can do today? What are the investments we can make today to increase the odds that in 5, 10, 20 years, the US economy is productive enough that we can make good on all of those promises without causing an inflation problem? The Republicans would say what? Tax cuts and deregulation are the best ways to produce an economy that is, maximum growth and high productivity. And the Democrats would say what? Education, infrastructure, R&D, but at least we would be having the right debate. Right? At least we would be having a good, constructive, productive debate over the real issues that matter instead of this phony, where the money is running out sort of debate. The US government is never going to run out of the US dollar. The US government is the scorekeeper for the dollar. It can't run out of dollars any more than a carpenter can run out of inches, or the scorekeeper here at Stony Brook can run out of points when the football team is putting up 77 points in a game, and all the fans are sitting in the audience going, oh my God, what happens if they score again? They're never going to have enough points to put up. Yes, they will. They can't run out. The stadium can't run out of points. The US government can't run out of dollars. It's a unit, right? The government spends by instructing its bank to change the numbers in someone's account upward. That's how we pay for things. It's not actually by physically printing money and making payments. It's all done electronically. This is the debate I wish we were having. Instead of getting bogged down in the pay-for question, focus on the real things that matter. What can we afford? The answer isn't in financial terms. The answer is in real terms, if we want to do $1 trillion of infrastructure and somebody says, how are you going to pay for it? You should say, I'm going to pay for it by hiring 300,000 construction workers, by using X tons of steel, by using 2 or 3% of our unused spare capacity in our factories, by mobilizing this many machines and heavy equipment. And so that's how you pay for it. Real resources. And if you don't have them, if the economy is already operating at full employment and everybody's being used, all the workers are already employed, all the resources are currently being used, then you can't afford it, right? But if you have spare capacity, if you have idle people, if you have idle machines, if the raw materials are there, then the government can step in and say, now would be a good time because we can mobilize these resources in a responsible way. That means without causing inflation, without competing for those resources with other people who are currently using. They're not being used. We can hire them, put them to work, and improve the standard of living, right? In the interest of the public good. So thank you very much.
All right. How many of you all actually think to yourselves, wow, we can't afford anything. We can't afford these things. These people are crazy. You know, I think we have a lot of people out there, quite frankly, who really, really believe that, who really believe that the United States is somehow or another broke, can't afford it, is completely and utterly destitute. Well, it's not true. So what I want to do is I want to give you the layperson's version of MMT. After you heard sort of, even though that was pretty down to earth, I could still tell that there are a lot of people out there that genuinely don't understand a lot of what was said. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a crack at it. The first thing that came to me was understanding who is a currency issuer and who is a currency user. And why does this matter? So people conflate the states, they conflate the federal government as one thing. They don't realize the economy is made up of a whole bunch of different entities that have different roles within it. The federal government created the dollar from thin air. It's just a unit of account. As she said in there, it's an inch or a dollar or a sound, a decibel. You can't run out of scores on the scoreboard. It's a unit of account. So the dollar isn't my precious. Dollars are created and they're destroyed every single day. As Warren Mosler would say, a dollar is nothing more than a tax credit. Your dollar is the only thing that can actually pay your obligation for taxes. You cannot pay your taxes in anything other than the US dollar. So that is what provides the value, if you will. That is what makes your dollar hold on to its ability to purchase things, is the fact that we tax in that dollar. So getting back to it, I said there's currency issuers and currency users. The federal government is the currency issuer. It created all the rules surrounding the dollar out of thin air. Every last one of them was created by a law, and it spoke the dollar into existence. The states are currency users. The states cannot create dollars at will. The states are dependent on the federal government to create them. So if you think about the way a lot of folks look at the economy, look at programs, look at the way they would like to see Medicare for all go out, look at the way they'd like to see a Green New Deal go out, there are a lot of people talking about how they'd like to have a local Green New Deal or a local Medicare for all or a local this or a local that, when the reality is that the federal government is the currency issuer. It spends the money into existence whenever Congress authorizes spending. Whenever it taxes, it deletes that money from existence. However, the states, they typically have to live on what they call a balanced budget. The states have to rely on tax revenues. This is pretty interesting when you think about it, because the federal government, most folks are thinking, is like their household budget. But it couldn't be anything further from the truth. The states are very, very much like your household budget in the sense that they can go broke. They must have tax revenues to pay their bills. They must have some sort of revenues, whether it be bonds or whatever. But the federal government creates money every single time it spends. And every time it spends, it is a new dollar. It doesn't reuse dollars. Those dollars is the very first time they see the light of day is when they're spent into existence. And when they're deleted from existence is when they've been received as a tax. So does this make sense? Is this easy for you to understand? For me, it took a lot to understand that the economy was nothing more than really a circuit. When the federal government spends that money into existence, that's the very first time it sees the light of day. And when it deletes it, that's basically its death. It's done its job and it's put away. And it keeps going over and over and over again. Many, many moons ago, many moons ago, many of you all are too young to even remember this, but going back to 1971, Richard Nixon took us off of the gold standard. The gold standard, or the Bretton Woods Accord at the time, was a worldwide standard that pegged the currency, in other words, tied the value of the currency to a certain weight of gold. Well, Richard Nixon removed that, what we call a peg, and gave us a sovereign, free-floating, in other words, it doesn't have anything pegged to any commodity whatsoever. The value of the dollar rises and falls freely. So it's a sovereign, meaning the government itself is the powerful user, can spend it into existence at will. Free-floating, meaning that it's not pegged to a currency or commodity. Non-convertible, in other words, you can't force demand them giving you a certain weight of gold in exchange for your dollar anymore. Your dollar is worth $1 in tax credit. So sovereign, free-floating, non-convertible, fiat currency. In other words, by decree, it's the government's unit of account. So this oftentimes is something that many people haven't heard before either. They don't understand it. They're thinking gold standard. So when they talk about quantity of money, you're going to print too much money, it's going to cause inflation. You're going to print more money. It's constantly what you hear within the activist community, within the media, from your schools, etc. So many moons ago, Milton Friedman, who was a right-wing the king neoliberal himself, fraudulently came up with something called quantity theory of money. He fudged his numbers, and he used it as a battering ram or a stick to beat us down and keep us from believing that the government could spend money on the people. So people believe that anytime the government spends money, it's creating inflation. But they don't realize, again, every time the government taxes, it deletes money. So it doesn't just keep printing money into infinity. It actually is deleting that money, as it taxes. So I want you all to think about this for a minute. If in 1971 we were removed from the gold standard, if the fact that we tax money out of existence and that we no longer print money, because printing money was something we did when we were on the gold standard, what is it that constrains us? Why do they always tell us that we are broke? Why is it that the government is always, talking about how we've got to make tough decisions, we've got to cinch our belt up, we've got to, make really, really hard choices, and we got to cut spending, we got to reduce the deficit, we got to do all these things? I don't know the answer to that other than I can say that Roger Malcolm Mitchell would tell you that it's the gap, the whole gap, and nothing but the gap, which is the gap between the wealthy and the poor. They keep this in mind because they want to keep us from demanding too much. Because if you understand that the dollar isn't pegged to gold or anything and that the country can never go broke, all of a sudden you might start dreaming, what can I do with this money? What can we as a nation do now that we know that we're not constrained? It's just something that we need to be able to talk about, and that's something that you heard in the video previously. So when you understand, number one, that we're on a sovereign, free-floating, non-convertible fiat currency, you understand that the government doesn't print money, that it spends money into existence when Congress authorizes it, and it taxes it out of existence when it's received as a tax. Why would we be wondering if we can afford Medicare for all? Why would we be wondering if we can afford a Green New Deal? Why would we be wondering if we can afford to get rid of student debt? Why would we think that we couldn't do great things? Well, there's a lot of mysticism that is baked into the economy today. And what I found for myself is that I didn't understand what the national debt was, because they keep trying to make it seem like we took out a credit card from China and that we're deeply in debt and that we're broke and this debt is just going to kill us. And they keep showing that debt clock, and that debt clock is scary because those are some really, really big numbers. And then they tell us about we got to reduce the deficit. Most people don't have a clue what the deficit is. And they just run around, we got to reduce the deficit. But this is a mind game. This is a game that goes back to the gold standard. We never updated our textbooks. We never updated any of the literature. We didn't even update the media. We didn't update our schools. We didn't update anything. So everyone is living in a fiat world, but by gold standard logic. It doesn't make any sense. Until you look at the bell curve from about 1978 all the way through present, you can clearly see back in the early to late, middle to late 70s, the wealth gap started exponentially growing and growing and growing because they had stopped spending on the people and they had started making us go into private debt. By going into private debt, we keep the economy going by borrowing bank money, by taking out a loan to buy a car, by taking out a loan to buy a house, by taking out a loan to go to college. So since the government wasn't fueling economic growth through spending and domestic spending, the government put the burden on the backs of the people to grow the economy by going deeper and deeper and deeper into private debt. Now, one of the things that Stephanie, I don't know if you saw it or not, but she kind of talked about something called sectoral balances. And sectoral balances are a very, very key component to modern monetary theory. Sectoral balances are how you measure where you are in an economy. Once you get down the currency user and the currency issuer part, once you get the sovereign free-floating fiat currency that's non-convertible part, once you understand the role of taxation is to drive currency, not for funding programs. It's just to fuel the economy, to keep that thing going, to keep the motor going. Once you understand that, then you have to ask yourself, where does the money go? How do we know when we should spend, when we should tax, etc., etc.? And sectoral balances are a thing that goes beyond modern monetary theory, but it really informs modern monetary theory, and it measures three separate sectors. One is the public sector, two is the private sector, and three is what we call rest of world. So you look at the private sector and you say, hey, do we have a lot of room to grow debt there? Well, if you look at the United States right now, we have huge record levels of private debt, so much private debt, it will never be paid off. Never. You look at public debt. Well, public debt, quite frankly, is the one debt that we really never have to pay back because it's not debt like what you and I know. You and I, we have to borrow money from a bank or borrow it from somewhere. And when we get that money, we can't save it because we ultimately have to pay it back. So the federal government, however, doesn't have that, because a lot of people want to save money, so the government has to spend enough money into the economy to adjust for saving desires. Or the third sector, which is rest of world, which is our balance of trade. Are we a net importer or are we a net exporter? Well, the United States has been a net importer now for many, many years, to the tune of about $500 billion annually. That $500 million in trade deficit, if you will, has to be made up somewhere within the bathtub of the economy. Now, if you think about the bathtub being the full economy, all right, you understand that the water rises and falls depending upon how much economic activity is in it. And in this case, because the federal government has not spent on the people, and because the people are full of private debt, and because the nation doesn't have a net exporter stance, it is a net importer. Not only are we spending letting $500 billion a year go out of the country, but the people are tapped and they don't have room for more private debt. There's a huge student debt bubble ready to burst. There's lots and lots of corporate debt based on stock buybacks. There is a ton of just completely saturated, like overly burdened, overly debt burdened, industries and people in this country. So that leaves us with one area really to replace that money and keep the economy afloat, and that is the federal government deficit spending. Now, if you look at deficit spending, most people fear that because they think of deficits as their deficit. What they don't understand is that all of MMT is accounting. Almost all of it comes back to accounting identities. So one person's spending is another person's income. One person's deficit is another person's surplus. And if you look, the federal government, when it's in deficit, that means the non-governmental sector is in surplus. But what happens when the federal government is in surplus? Well, the federal government doesn't have a piggy bank with crumpled up old dollar bills in it. The federal government, when it receives money in a tax, deletes it. So a government surplus is kind of a misnomer, because the government neither has dollars nor doesn't have dollars. The government spends money into existence. Interesting, right? So if you think about this, when you have a government deficit, that's our surplus, that's our savings, that's our private savings. Now you can quibble over where that savings is taking place, and it always seems to be taking place with the wealthy right now. Why is that? Well, it's because we haven't used our fiscal space. In other words, Congress hasn't spent money on the people in a very, very long time. So with that in mind, I want to take another stab at this and realize that when you're looking at the ledger, if you were watching it like a some sort of a graph, if you will, if you looked at the government side of the graph, it would be a mirror image on the non-government sector. You would have, if debt goes up here, then you would see savings go here. And bottom line is that the two sides will mirror each other because, again, one person's debt is another person's asset. One person's income is another person's spending. On and on. You see what I mean? This is how that double entry accounting game works. And MMT lives by accounting identities, tracing things back and forth across a ledger. It's not how you feel. It's not some idea that you had. It's the way it is on the accounting. And so MMT is unassailable. because it literally traces the dollars back and forth. It's important to understand the role that Congress plays in every bit of this. Congress alone has the authority to spend money, the power of the purse. Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution gives them that authority. Now, just like a good manager can delegate authority, Congress has delegated its authority to the Federal Reserve, who has a shared balance sheet with the Treasury. So the Treasury will spend money from its accounts that it has marked up with keystrokes from the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve doesn't just randomly print money or anything like that. The Federal Reserve waits on information from Congress. When Congress passes a bill, whatever, it makes entries into accounts and the money is spent. It's that simple. Now, I want to take us to the next piece, and that is called the Federal Job Guarantee. The Federal Job Guarantee is a very important component of modern monetary theory. In some ways, you could say the job guarantee is like a policy prescription, until you remember that the tax, the purpose of the tax, which we didn't address yet, is to in fact allow the government room to provision itself. The government issues a tax because if it didn't issue a tax, what would you do with these pieces of paper? Why would you go build a road? Why would you go build a castle? Why would you go build the Washington Monument? Or why would you, drive a truck for the government? Or why would you push a piece of paper for the government? Why would you fly an airplane for the government? Why would you do anything for the government? Because you need that piece of paper to pay your tax. And so the government issued a tax to drive the need for this currency. It's pretty simple when you think about it. But tax-driven money is what I'm sure there's other debt obligations possible. But the tax is what we typically use to drive the need for currency. You show up to work because you need to get a piece of paper. It's not just so you can pay for things and buy your house and stuff. It's because you have taxes you have to pay, payable only in that currency. If that wasn't the case, you might make different choices. Even with things like Bitcoin, you have to convert your Bitcoin to United States dollars in order to pay your taxes. Bitcoin is not a currency. It is a commodity. It is an envelope, if you will, a store of value that you put dollars into basically, and it sends it on its way, it unpacks those dollars and floats around. But it is not a currency. The currency is still the United States government's unit of account. You don't have 30 Bitcoin, you have $300 of Bitcoin. So keep that in mind. In order for it to matter, your currency has to actually be accepted. All right, flash forward. One more thing. The United States debt is the sum total of every dollar that has not been taxed in existence today. It's more than just treasuries. It's every dollar from the dawn of history that has not been taxed. So if we pay off the national debt, what have we done? We have literally eliminated the money supply. Think about that, because all money is debt. The dollar is debt. It's all debt. It's debt in terms of it is able to be used in terms of settling an obligation. And that obligation is your tax liability. And it's also used to create buyers and sellers of goods. All right. Now, let's talk about Social Security for a moment. Long ago, FDR created the Social Security Administration, created the benefit that we call Social Security. And for many, many years, Americans have believed that when they pay FICA taxes, that they have quote-unquote paid into Social Security. Well, there is no old piggy bank with crumpled up old dollar bills in it. There's no hay pennies in it. There's no, there's nothing in it. It's a spreadsheet. This Social Security Trust Fund is nothing more than a spreadsheet. Every dollar spent from the Social Security is a new dollar. Every dollar collected in FICA taxes is deleted. The trust fund is merely an accounting thing. It's just merely tracking. It has nothing to do with anything. Those dollars could be expanded exponentially. They could be cut. They could be changed. We could add different categories to Social Security. It wouldn't matter at all. So the question is, if we expand Social Security or whatever, do we have a society, do we have an economy that's producing the goods and services required to meet the demand of the people receiving Social Security? It has nothing to do with solvency, because every dollar is just created with keystrokes. There is no shortage of dollars. There is a shortage of political will. There is a shortage of knowledge, but there isn't a shortage of dollars. Dollars are created at will. So this brings us to something called inflation. And there's a lot of different bits of inflation out there. But inflation is a persistent rise in the cost of overall goods. It's not just the rise of one good or service, or the rise in the price of your student loans, or the rise in the price of milk. Inflation is a persistent rise in prices across the board. So one of the things that we typically talk about with MMT, people ask, well, where's the limit on spending? How much can you spend? And the answer that MMTers say is that, hey, it's about real resources. It's not about balancing the budget. It's about balancing the economy. Do we have the real resources, the productive capacity, the factory capacity, the employment capacity, the real goods and services capacity to meet demand? If we do, then we can spend. If we don't, then we can't. We can't afford it then. But we've got a lot of slack in our economy. People have been forsaking getting their teeth fixed forever. They've been forsaking getting medical things taken care of forever. They've been forsaking getting their homes fixed. Things have been let go. Lots and lots of dilapidated buildings around the country, schools, you name it. So much room for us to spend because there is so much pent-up need for these things. And the real resources are there. So the idea of inflation really comes down to not have you printed too much money. That's quantity theory of money, and that's Milton Friedman, and that's not what it's about. The issue is, do we have enough goods and services available for purchase that people want to purchase with these dollars that they have? And I think you can look across the board and realize that we're a long way off. We've been trying to get inflation, and we can't get inflation. Places like Japan have a 250% debt to GDP ratio. They cannot get to 2% inflation. Inflation is not a big deal at all. In fact, we're a long way off from it. Is inflation a concern? Absolutely. We always should balance against inflation. Now, is inflation always bad? No, it's not. Sometimes it's good to have some inflation. It expands the economy. It lessens the need or the burden on debt holders. It allows people to get out of debt quicker with inflation. There's a whole bunch of different things that make an it depends kind of answer. This brings us to the next question, and that's hyperinflation. You hear a lot of people talking about hyperinflation. Hyperinflation is a rejection of the currency. And it happens way before we ever print money or anyone prints money. It's usually brought on by political corruption or foreign debt denominated in a foreign currency that makes the local currency useless because there's not enough productive capacity to meet the demand. So let's start with a couple of the favorites. Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe is an agricultural community. Mugabe, who was the leader, he took away the farmland from seasoned farmers that knew how to make the crops grow and knew how to distribute it, etc., and gave it to the black farmers who were untrained and unskilled at the time. And what had ended up happening was the entire productive capacity of Zimbabwe was decimated. And they didn't have the productive capacity to meet the demand. And so it didn't matter how much money they printed, they only had so many vegetables for people to eat, and they were desperate for it. And so you saw a perpetual rise in prices to the point where they had a hyperinflation. The printing of money happened well after the fiasco that Mugabe did. The next one, another favorite, is Weimar Republic. Weimar Republic is going back to Nazi Germany. Even before Nazi Germany, we're talking about the results of the Treaty of Versailles from World War I. The Treaty of Versailles was extremely cruel and harsh, and the people of Germany were decimated. The debts that were put onto Germany were payable only in French francs. So the German people couldn't print Reichsmarks. They couldn't print the German Reichsmark to pay their debts. They could only do it in French francs. So that meant their entire productive capacity, all their goods and services were sent elsewhere. They didn't have the ability. And so in order to get bread, they just kept printing money, and you could see barrels of Reichsmarks and so forth laying around. And that, my friends, is how Germany ended up having a hyperinflation. It wasn't about printing money. It was about the fact that they were decimated by debt denominated in a foreign currency. And they were unable to meet the productive capacity that was required for the people who demanded food and water and basic sustenance. They couldn't even keep up with that. So then the printing of money commenced, and there was the hyperinflation. Again, neither Zimbabwe nor Weimar Republic had anything to do with printing money. It was always political corruption, foreign debt, a diminished capacity in terms of producing goods and services, etc. Think about that. People talk about hyperinflation like it just happens all the time. It doesn't. And it's not about fiat currency. It's not about any of that. It's about 100% about political corruption, foreign debt, inability to meet demand. There you have it. And there's a bunch of others that we could touch on, but at this point in time, it's the one and the same. Venezuela, lots of foreign debt, a single commodity in terms of oil-based products. The foreign markets were able to drop the bottom of it. Their debt was denominated in foreign currency. They couldn't pay for it with their own currency. They printed more money, hyperinflation. They weren't able to keep up with demand. Boom, another one. And there was a lot of political corruption, courtesy of the United States, I'm sure. But that's not really MMT. That's just sort of fodder for you. But again, Venezuela wasn't about printing money either. Venezuela was about corruption, a single commodity that was able to be messed with by the global community, and an inability to meet the production demands of their countrymen and women. All right. Now, when you drive into a local city sometime and you see people freezing, you need to understand that's a political choice. It's not necessary. We can afford to take care of them. We can afford housing. We can afford food. We can afford health care. Affordability is not the issue. Unfortunately, there's an awful lot of Calvinism still left in America today. Well, if you did better, you'd made a better choice, then you would be able to have better things. Hard work will get you where you need to be. Well, we know that's horseshit. We know that's not true. We know it's a lottery. It's a gamble. And once you fall off the wagon, it's almost impossible to get back on. The economy is built like a casino. You go into it, and most times you walk out with nothing. Sometimes not even the clothes on your back. So with that, I'm hoping that you all take some of these lessons, take some of this information, and teach somebody. Learn, find videos. Deficit Owls is out there. They've got great information. A lot of it is our videos, which is nice. But don't waste this time. Don't start cheering for Tulsi and Bernie and all the other ones yet. We need people to learn economics, or we're going to get stuck with a neoliberal that doesn't know it. And then we're going to end up screwed. It truly is in our hands. And with that, my name's Steve Grumbine. I'm with Real Progressives, and I hope you have a great day.